At CIA headquarters in the summer of 1953, Allen Dulles, the agency's director, recruits E. Howard Hunt as his propaganda chief in the plot to oust Arbenz.
And they took me into a small room in the agency and swore me a special oath. I must never tell what they were going to tell me.
The Americans' strongest ally inside Guatemala is the Catholic Church. The CIA contacts Cardinal Spellman in New York to take part in their psychological war against Arbenz. The Cardinal uses his authority to enlist the full cooperation of the head of the Guatemalan Church, Archbishop Arellano.
Cardinal Spellman convinced his counterpart in Guatemala to issue a pastoral letter several months before the coup, in which the Cardinal basically spelled out his message to the flock that they should rise up against the communists in Guatemala and overthrow them. And then the CIA took that pastoral letter and airlifted it around Guatemala.
We had gotten the okay from Cardinal Spellman to go ahead with this. And I wouldn't presume to trace the lines of authority within the Catholic Church, how they get their information, but they do. And we've always said, you know, in an admiring way, that the Jesuits formed the greatest intelligence service in the world, always have. The Jesuits formed the greatest intelligence service in the world, always have. The Jesuits formed the greatest intelligence service in the world, always have.
Yeah, so we're starting part 2 on the question of who killed JFK. There are two things I want to address. There's a video that came out recently called JFK-X, Solving the Crime of the Century, in which those who made this film said that that JFK actually wasn't assassinated, that he used a squib, what's called a squib. You know, it's something that's used in Hollywood to fake someone being shot, where you see like blood spouting out to make it look like someone's been assassinated. So in this documentary, they theorized that JFK actually used a squib, that he put a squib on the right side of his face where it looks like he's been shot. Just like literally seconds before he gets shot, that they say that he put a squib on his face, which then explodes. And they said that the reason why Jackie Kennedy climbed on top of the limousine as it was moving was to recover part of the squib. So just listen to let's read some of what it says here on the internet. It says that no, there is no factual evidence that JFK used a squib to fake his assassination. This claim originates from the 2023 conspiracy documentary JFK-X, Solving the Crime of the Century. The film, produced by Jay Widner and directed by Ryder Lee, theorizes that the explosion seen in frame 313 of the Zapruder film was a special effects squib detonated by Jacqueline Kennedy to simulate a fatal headshot. So that's what they are showing in this documentary, which I've actually watched. But although it can be a bit convincing, but it raises a lot of questions. I mean, for instance, for me, I think it's over 100 witnesses to the assassination that died within a space of about 12 months. Why did all those witnesses have to die? Simply because they believe that they saw JFK being assassinated. It doesn't make sense. There are many witnesses who were murdered or assassinated after JFK died because they had seen too much. For instance, even Jean Hill, who wrote that book that I showed you last time in the first video, it's called The Last Dissenting Witness. She had the brakes on her car tampered with, and she almost had a fatal crash when she was driving. I think she had a daughter with her in the car. Bear in mind, I read the book maybe a few years ago. someone tampered with the brakes, and I think her son was hit by a car whilst he was riding his bicycle. Fortunately, he wasn't killed, but there were many things that happened to try and silence her. She was threatened many times, and there were many like her also who were threatened. Some who ended up being assassinated. There was even one person who died from a karate chop to the neck. And things like that, there were doctors who were assassinated because they had seen too much. So I don't. This doesn't make sense that JFK faked his assassination. They were even saying in the documentary that JFK was a sickly person, which is true. They said that he couldn't basically finish his term or something as president, so he faked his assassination because he believed that if he died in a similar way to Abe Lincoln, then it would make him very popular amongst Americans, because Abe Lincoln was loved and is loved by Americans because he was a good president, and that's why they called him Honest Abe. But also because in the way that he died as a martyr. And the same thing is said about JFK in this documentary, that it would make him very popular if he faked his assassination and then left office in such a way. So yeah, I don't believe this theory here. Not because my search engine says so, but because of the overwhelming amount of evidence that I have. And I showed you all the books that I've read, some which I'm yet to read, and some which I'm still reading even at the moment, as part of my quest to find more truth and to unlearn false theories that I've been taught from the time I was born. Okay, and I'm going to share more books with you today as well. Some of which are not necessarily addressing the assassination of JFK, but are talking about events that were happening around that time. So that's the first thing I wanted to deal with. The second thing I want to talk about is Lee Harvey Oswald, because in the official story we're told that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin who was a radicalized communist who hated JFK. Okay, there's no shred of evidence that Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated JFK. Of course, Lee Harvey Oswald himself was a CIA agent who had actually lived in Russia, but I think he had been sent to Russia to try and infiltrate Russia, but he failed and then came back to the US. He actually married a Russian woman. But the basics is that Lee Harvey Oswald actually worked for the CIA, and he had actually in a book called JFK and the Unspeakable. I think, if I remember the title correctly, I shared it with you last time in part one. Lee Harvey Oswald and some other men had actually thwarted an assassination attempt on JFK when he had visited Chicago. And he had tried to do this to also thwart the assassination on JFK in Dallas, which is in Texas, but failed. And then they pinned him as the lone assassin. And of course, Lee Harvey Oswald didn't even shoot even one bullet at JFK. After the assassination, there were photos that were taken, and it shows that Lee Harvey Oswald was actually outside the book depository. He wasn't running away. They make it look like or make it sound like he was running away, and then he was caught in a theater watching a movie. I mean, if he was running away, why would he be in a theater watching a movie? It was all because he was being scapegoated and being used as a patsy to take the blame for the assassination. In fact, Lee Harvey Oswald actually said there are videos online that you can watch where he said that he was a patsy. He was just being used as a scapegoat or the fall guy to take the blame. And of course, the single gunman theory has been used many times. In fact, even with the assassination of Abe Lincoln, it said that there was only one assassin, which is not true. It's always a conspiracy. For instance, there was an organization called the Knights of the Golden Dawn, which later was rebranded and became the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. They were involved in the assassination. Of course, ultimately, it was the Jesuits. There are many books that have been written fingering the Catholic Church and the Jesuits, the assassination of Abe Lincoln. So it wasn't just John Wilkes Booth who acted alone. This is something that we're fed as a public so that we don't find out that there's a greater conspiracy behind these assassinations. So in the case of JFK, in part one, I didn't really focus so much on the men who were involved in the assassination, but I'll share some of that with you today in this video. Of course, I can't name every single person. Some of the men are not even known, but I will name those who are known based on my research. Okay. So even this photo here that I'm showing here, this was found to have been doctored. Okay. In fact, some of you might not know this about me, but I actually studied art and design in college in Zimbabwe. Things like this can easily be done. You can take the head of Lee Harvey Oswald and put it on someone else's body. And in fact, if you look at this photo, critically, you'll find that it's kind of disproportionate. There's something wrong with this photo. The head looks a bit too big. In fact, there are some who researched this who have analyzed this photo and said that the body on this person, which is obviously not Lee Harvey Oswald, it was the body actually belonged to an FBI agent. There were marks or some signs on the body that showed that this person, the body in this photo was that of an FBI agent. And of course, the FBI was involved in the cover-up of the assassination, and I'll talk about that a bit. Lee Harvey also just definitely wasn't involved in the assassination of JFK. He actually tried to stop the assassination as he had done previously in Chicago. What's the next thing we can talk about? Something very interesting is that there were actually 3 tramps that were arrested on the day of the assassination. And what you have to bear in mind is that Dealey Plaza was actually, there used to be a Masonic shrine in Dealey Plaza. So in Freemasonry, they have a play in which they have 3 tramps. Okay, I can't remember all the details. You have to go and look it up yourselves in your own time. There's a play that they have in Masonry where they have 3 tramps. So it's been said by some that assassination of JFK, which happened, in Dealey Plaza, where there was a Masonic shrine, was actually a Masonic ritual. And hence why you had these 3 tramps who are said to have been hiding in a trailer somewhere near Dealey Plaza. They came out and initially were arrested, but then released when the Dallas police, of course, were also involved in the cover-up. They said that they released these 3 so-called tramps after they found them to not be involved in the assassination. But of course, this is just a play from Freemasonry. Let's start at the top here. So one of the men who was involved as well was George H.W. Bush, who was the dad. He's now late, but he was the dad to George Bush, who invaded Iraq along with Tony Blair, or gave the orders to invade Iraq along with Tony Blair in 2003. He, at the time of the assassination in 1963, was working for the CIA, and there are some who say that from some of the photos that were taken just after the assassination, there was someone who was standing outside. I think it's here. It says here book depository. Standing outside the book depository, there was someone there who looked like George H.W. Bush, based on the profile of the head and the haircut. It may not be very clear to you as you're watching, but this is George H.W. Bush, and there's someone standing here whose head has been blown up, and they've compared the profile of the head and they've said it looks like him. See here, Bush Sr., Dallas, November 22, 1963. Okay. So one of the things that happens actually in the world that we are not told about is that normally when someone does a very wicked deed, they are normally promoted. So George Bush went on to become the director of the CIA, and then later on he became president. Was basically rewarded for what he did in 1963. And also something quite important as well is that George Bush Sr. and his son George Bush Jr. were both members of Skull and Bones, as well as Mitt Romney. So when you saw into, I think it was the 2008 elections in America, where you had Mitt Romney going head to head with George Bush Jr. They were all basically, and it's also said that they're cousins as well, which is, I know some of this stuff is crazy. It's just like it's never ending. The rabbit hole, once you start going down the rabbit hole, you find so many things, and this is what J. Edgar Hoover was referring to. I'll get back to the issue of George Bush, but this is what J. Edgar Hoover was referring to when he said the individual is handicapped by coming face to face with a conspiracy so monstrous he cannot believe it exists. All this stuff I'm telling you right now, that George Bush Jr. and Mitt Romney are cousins, and they were all three of them, including George Bush Jr., were members of Skull and Bones, which is a secret society which takes an allegiance to obey the Pope. But these two George Bush Jr. and Mitt Romney went head to head in the elections in 2008, making it look like they were competing against each other, but actually they were working for the same side. This is what J. Edgar Hoover, who was also involved in the cover-up of the assassination, because J. Edgar Hoover was head of the FBI in 1963. Okay. So someone else who was also involved was Cardinal Joseph Francis Spellman, who was the Archbishop of New York at the time the assassination happened. And just listen to what it says here. We've got a poster here of Cardinal Spellman that shows him wearing, he's wearing his regalia as a cardinal, but on top of that he's wearing military regalia as well, military boots, and he's holding a rifle. And it says here in the poster, "Pass the Lord and praise the ammunition." Why? Because it says here, yes, this is a caricature of Cardinal Spellman, but it says he was criticized for his militaristic approach. So at the time, what was happening at the time of the assassination, there was an escalation of war in Vietnam, and Cardinal Spellman actually supported the war. But JFK didn't, and there are many photos online that shows Cardinal Spellman praying for soldiers and encouraging them to go to war. So here I've also got a photo of Cardinal Spellman with Winston Churchill. Now, isn't that a very interesting handshake you see there? That's actually a Masonic handshake. No one ever shakes hand. Normal people don't shake hands like that. This is Masonic, okay? It's interesting. Recently also there's a video which someone even sent it to me on my phone on WhatsApp, but I'd actually already seen it. There's a video on YouTube, I think, that shows Andy Burnham shaking hands with the Speaker of the House in the UK, and they're basically using the same or similar handshake. So I believe Andy Burnham might be a Mason and the Speaker of the House as well. So I'll share with you a video of there was a man called E. Howard Hunt, who was also a CIA agent, who said that the Jesuits form the greatest, what does it say here? The greatest intelligence agency in the world. How did you know about the Jesuits? Because of course the CIA is an offshoot of the Jesuits, and in fact E. Howard Hunt was involved. Remember here I'm sharing with you, some of the men. I'm telling you about some of the men who were involved in the JFK assassination. E. Howard Hunt was also involved in the assassination of JFK. How do we know that? Because he was fingered as being in Dallas on the day of the assassination. It's believed that he took part in the assassination. E. Howard Hunt took the men who accused him of being involved in the JFK assassination. He took them to court for defamation, I believe, of character, and he lost the case. Why? Because it was proved that he was actually there. This is E. Howard Hunt here I'm showing. He was there. When he was asked where he was on the day of the assassination, he said he couldn't remember. He kept changing his story. I think at one point he said he was at work and he was at home, and then he kept changing his story. But it was proved that he was actually in Dallas on the day of the assassination. Someone else as well who was involved was Frank Sturgis. Now, Frank Sturgis was also a CIA agent who bragged to his girlfriend after the assassination that they basically had killed JFK, and his girlfriend actually came out later on and said that she'd actually said that to him. I think she had actually been invited to go along and take part, but she refused. Afterwards, she came out and said that Frank Sturgis had said this to her. Then we have J. Edgar Hoover, some say that he was a cross-dresser and a homosexual, was the head of the FBI, or the director of the FBI at the time of the assassination. He was involved in covering up the assassination. Okay. So if we go here, I've actually shared this before, but you see here that the Jesuit general, this was written in 1848, but even this statement was probably made before 1848. He said, "See, my lord," he was talking to, who was he talking to? To a French lord, okay. He said, "See, my lord, from this room I govern not only Paris, but China. Not only China, but the whole world, without anyone knowing how it is managed," okay. What basically this means is how it is managed, okay. The Jesuit general was already bragging that he was governing the whole world before 1848. So imagine in 1963, when the decision had been made that America should be involved in these forever wars and not escalate the war in Vietnam and Cambodia and the surrounding countries. JFK wanted to go against that. I remember I read for you last time that JFK wanted to de-escalate the war in Vietnam after he had a report had been done for him by McNamara and some of the government officials, discouraging him from going to escalating the war in Vietnam. He wanted to de-escalate the war, but of course here, someone else who was more powerful had decided that America should escalate the war, and not just escalate the war in Vietnam, but also start conducting these forever wars. Something else that I shared with you in the past was this chart here, probably the best chart that I've seen of the hierarchy of world rule, where it shows that, here it says political parties. You can see that politicians are down here. Okay, they are not supposed to make decisions that affect the world order. There are others who are very high, who are much higher up in the hierarchy here, who are supposed to decide things. So JFK was down here. He was trying to decide things that would basically affect the bankers, affect the military-industrial complex, which is based in Washington, D.C., affect the secret societies, and affect the Jesuits and the Catholic Church and the black nobility. The very rich families in the world, the royal families that are also involved in pulling the strings. You see here the monarchies, the religious orders. So you have the Knights of Malta, Constantinian, the Knights of Columbus, Opus Dei, and the Knights of Malta, which are not written down here, but he was going to upset the Bilderbergers, the CFR, the Trilateral Commission, Club of Rome, Davos. Of course, you have WEF and the CIA and the Mossad. He was going to affect all these organizations, and they were not happy about that. It affect the Jews, who are basically the keepers of the Vatican treasury, according to F. Tapasosi in his book Rulers of Evil. And the Freemasons, I think I've already mentioned. JFK was down here, and the United Nations, obviously, which was started by the Jesuits, the IMF, the World Bank, and the Federal Reserve, which is obviously linked to banking. He was going to upset all of them if they allowed him to carry on, so he had to be removed. This is just one of the reasons why he had to be, one of many reasons why he had to be removed. There was no way they would allow him to do things that this hierarchy above the politicians was not in line with. Okay. Let me just share those other books that I mentioned earlier. So last time I mentioned a book called The Falsification of History by John Hamer, but I just want to read something for you from that book. Okay. It says here, and this is on page 36. It says, in 1913, the United States acquired its own Bank of England. type organization with the surreptitious passing of the Federal Reserve Act through Congress in the early hours of the morning of the 23rd of December, whilst opposition was at a minimum, most congressmen having already left for their Christmas holiday break. Congressman Charles Lindbergh Sr., the father of the famous flyer, was offered a $2 million incentive not to publish his book, Banking and Currency and the Money Trust, which exposed the threat posed by the Federal Reserve System. In fact, shortly before the end of his political career, Lindbergh formally moved to impeach the members of the Federal Reserve Board and offered a 15-count indictment of their conspiracy. The motion, however, was unsurprisingly buried and forgotten by the Congressional Judiciary Committee. As with the formation of the Bank of England, this act in effect gave power to create money to a group of private individual bankers outside of elected government. Therefore, the Federal Reserve is not federal, i.e. of the government at all, and neither does it have any reserves, another gross deceit. Whosoever controls the volume of money in any country is absolute master of all industry and commerce. And when you realize that the entire system is very easily controlled, one way or another, by a few powerful men at the top, you will not have to be told how periods of inflation and depression originate. This was former US President James Garfield in 1881. Within weeks of making this statement, President Garfield was assassinated. So you see how last time in part one I mentioned that JFK was not the only one to be assassinated, especially for instance, for going against the bankers. There were many in the past, including Abe Lincoln was assassinated for stopping slavery, but also for going against the bankers as well. There was also Andrew Jackson and others who either had assassination attempts or were actually assassinated. It says here, and slightly more recently, on the 4th of June 1963, presidential executive order, this is supposed to say 11110, was signed by President J.F. Kennedy, directing the U.S. Treasury to issue a new U.S. currency. This new currency was to be backed by the precious metal silver, in effect bypassing and isolating the Federal Reserve. In the same way that, let me just stop there, but in the same way that, Jesus actually, when Jesus was overturning the tables of the money changers, the money changers were actually bankers, okay? So Jesus was the first one to go against the bankers, and they partly were responsible for assassinating him by having him crucified on a cross. So in control, by passing this law, which allowed the government to print its own money, it says that JFK was bypassing and isolating the Federal Reserve in control of currency issuance since 1913. President Kennedy's signing of Executive Order 11110 effectively returned the power to issue currency back to the U.S. Treasury and therefore the people, thereby ending the then 50-year monopoly of private bankers and the Federal Reserve Bank over U.S. currency. 5 months later, on the 22nd, 5 months later after he issued this executive order, on the 22nd of November 1963, JFK was famously shot and killed in Dallas, Texas, supposedly by Lee Harvey Oswald, known to be CIA agent but described as a deranged lone gunman. You see, even in the official story of the assassination of JFK, I don't think they actually even mentioned that Lee Harvey Oswald was a CIA agent. This perhaps it's being mentioned here and there now because it came out and they can't stop it from coming out. And it's interesting. Something else that's interesting is that the only film that we've seen of the assassination is the Zapruder film, which is has quite clearly been tampered with, because it was only released years later, and I think even in the 70s, and yet the assassination took place in 1963. What happened to all the films? For instance, either Jean Hill or her friend, who were just right next to the road where JFK's limousine passed by, they were actually taking films. And there were many others who took films that day, but the films were confiscated by federal agents. Okay. Why have we not seen what's on those films? So here it says, 5 months after this executive order was issued by JFK, he was famously shot and killed in Dallas, Texas, supposedly by Lee Harvey Oswald, known to be CIA agent, but described as a deranged lone gunman by the lackeys of the media, who was conveniently disposed of himself. They're talking about Lee Harvey Oswald here, was disposed of himself 2 days later by yet another deranged lone gunman, Jack Ruby, full name Jack Rubinstein, who just happened to be a CIA colleague of Oswald. So Jack Ruby was in the CIA, Lee Harvey Oswald was in the CIA. Ruby later developed a particularly fast-acting cancer whilst awaiting trial, which literally killed him in days rather than months or years. Same with the vaccine that many people took during this pandemic. In some cases causes a very fast-acting cancer to develop, which kills them in a very short of time. It's commonly known these days as turbo cancer. Just reading on here, it says, all a coincidence, you decide, but just before you do so, consider that the new president, Lyndon B. Johnson's first official action as president was to immediately revoke the decision to implement Executive Order 11110, literally within hours of taking office. The law, in fact, still stands on the US statute books, but unsurprisingly, no president since that time has chosen to use it. So Lyndon Baines Johnson is someone else as well who was involved in the assassination. Why would he do that? What would be the motive? Because he wanted to be president. In fact, LBJ, as is sometimes referred to, took is it the vow as president, because since he was vice president, he then on the plane, he actually, after the assassination, he took his presidential oath rather on the plane just within hours of the assassination, which just shows that. And he was actually seen smiling to a colleague on the plane. There are photos of all this online if you look for them. Let me just continue reading here, maybe a few more sentences. In addition, when the Warren Commission was formed to investigate Kennedy's death, one of the commission members was none other than John J. McCloy, president of the Chase Manhattan Bank and the World Bank and member of the Federal Reserve Board. Remember I showed you in the chart, if you just go back here. So what does it say here? That John McCloy was president of Chase Manhattan Bank and the World Bank and member of the Federal Reserve Board. So we have the World Bank. The World Bank is mentioned here. Where it says WB is the World Bank, okay. And then we have the Federal Reserve as well here, the Fed. This John McCloy was a member of these two organizations. JFK was down here. His actions were going to upset these organizations which are above the political parties. Bearing in mind that in part one, I shared with you how the issue of this executive order, which was signed by JFK, which was going to affect the Federal Reserve. In fact, he wanted to destroy the Federal Reserve as well as the CIA and also stop or de-escalate the war in Vietnam. All this was going to upset all these organizations, and they wouldn't allow that to happen. Now, why would this be? Why was this man here was president of Chase Manhattan Bank and also a member of the World Bank and the Federal Reserve? Why was he on the commission which was formed to so-called investigate JFK's assassination? Why was he on this commission? What on earth has a presidential murder investigation to do with banking? I really wonder. Of course, it's to do with the fact that JFK wanted to destroy the Federal Reserve by allowing the American government to print its own money. Let me share something else over here. There's also a book called Vietnam, Why Did We Go?, written by Avram Manhattan, who is now late, died quite a while ago. The subtitle of this book is The Religious Beginnings of an Unholy War. Listen to what he says here in the preface. The political and military origin of the War of Vietnam has been described with millions of written and spoken words. Yet nothing has been said about one of the most significant forces which contributed to its promotion, namely the role played by religion, which in this case means the part played by the Catholic Church and by her diplomatic counterpart, the Vatican. Their active participation is not mere speculation. It's talking about the participation of the Catholic Church. It is an historical fact as concrete as the presence of the US or the massive guerrilla resistance of Asian communism. The activities of the last two have been scrutinized by thousands. The activities of the US and the Asian communists have been scrutinized by thousands of books, but the former, the Catholic Church, has never been assessed, not even in a summarized form. The Catholic Church must be considered as a main promoter in the origin. Just like the Catholic Church was involved in the genocide, some say so, it wasn't a genocide, it was a civil war between the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda. Okay, the Catholic Church must be considered as a main promoter in the origin, escalation, and prosecution of the Vietnamese conflict. From the very beginning, this religious motivation helped set in motion the avalanche that was to cause endless agonies in the Asiatic and American continents. The price paid was immense, thousands of billions of dollars, the mass dislocation of entire populations, political anarchy, military devastation on an unprecedented scale, the disgrace upon the civilized world, the loss of thousands of young Asian and American lives, last but not least, the wounding, mutilation, and death of hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children. Okay, I won't carry on reading. So the summary of this book here, Vietnam, Why Did We Go, is that Alfred Manhattan says that the reason why the war in Vietnam happened was because the Catholic Church wanted to force its religion on the inhabitants of that region, not just Vietnam, but you have Laos and Cambodia and other places, because those areas of the world are mostly Buddhist. Remember that the Catholic Church doesn't like competition, so they wanted that area of the world to become Catholic. And you find that DM and his brother were both very staunch Roman Catholics, and later on, just before JFK was assassinated, those two also got assassinated because they were actually persecuting the Buddhists and causing an escalation of the situation in Vietnam. So just bear in mind that JFK wanted to de-escalate the war, but the Catholic Church wanted to go into that region to force Catholicism on the Buddhists in that area, in that region. So because basically JFK went against the Catholic Church, he had to be removed. So the last thing I want to share with you is just once again going through the men who were involved in killing JFK. We have Pedro Arrupe, who was the general of the Society of Jesus at the time, who said that whose counterpart, let's see who that was. I think it was Michael Tamburini, who was the general of the Jesuits at the time this statement was made, claimed that before 1848, the general of the Jesuits already ruled the world. Okay, so we have here Pedro Arrupe is definitely involved in not personally pulling the trigger, but giving the go-ahead for JFK to be removed. And maybe the order even came from him, basically, because JFK was upsetting a lot of people and making many enemies. And then we have Pope Paul VI, who was the Pope at the time of the assassination. We have, sorry, this is supposed to say Cardinal Spellman, who I've spoken about already. He was the Archbishop of New York and a very militaristic Archbishop as well, who promoted war and condoned the war in Vietnam. We have Allen Dulles, who was sacked. Actually, I didn't speak about this in part one, but Allen Dulles, who was sacked by JFK from the CIA, as well as his two deputies were sacked as well. But it's interesting that Allen Dulles actually, very important. It's just like we have John McCloy being on the Warren Commission. Allen Dulles was also on the commission, but yet he had been fired from the CIA by JFK. So Alan Dulles was a former CIA director, but he had a motive for being involved in the assassination of JFK. And we have George H.W. Bush, who was in the CIA, later on became the director of the CIA and went on to become president of the United States. He had a motive because he wanted to be promoted, okay? And as a CIA agent, was obviously supposed to follow orders, even if those orders involved removing the president of the United States. Lyndon Baines Johnson, who benefited from the assassination. He was vice president at the time and then became president on the same day that JFK was assassinated. Frank Sturgis, who was in the CIA, bragged to his girlfriend that he had been involved in the killing of the president. So just going back to this theory that JFK wasn't assassinated, that a squib was used to make it look like he had been shot. Well, there were many shots that were fired that day, even witnesses say up to about 12 shots were fired, including a shot that hit the curb near where the limousine was going past, and it actually broke part of the curb. There were many shots that were fired into the Lincoln limousine, which in the investigation, the limousine was actually tampered with. There's evidence of all this, okay? And of course, we have the magic bullet theory, where Governor Connelly, I think is his name, who was the governor of Texas at the time of the assassination. He was also shot as well, but they then claimed, the CIA claimed that, or the government claimed that the same bullet that struck JFK also struck Governor Connelly, which is ridiculous. They say that they called it the magic bullet theory. Okay, there were many bullets that were fired that day that went into the windscreen of the limousine, and other bullets hit Connelly, and of course there were several bullets that hit JFK, and some of the bullets actually missed. So we also have spoken about Frank Sturgis, and E. Howard Hunt was involved, and then in terms of pulling the trigger on the rifles that were used, there were other men who were also involved. I'm not saying that these two specifically were the only ones who were shooting. There were many men, some behind the limousine and some in front, okay, who were shooting at at JFK. We have J. Edgar Hoover, who was the director of the FBI, who covered up the investigation. Of course, we have Dallas police as well. Those who were heading Dallas police. Bear in mind, and I know this for a fact, having worked in the police in the UK, that the police forces worldwide are full of Freemasons. In fact, even when I was in the police in the UK, I used to see they used to put little posters up, like for example, in the men's toilets, promoting Freemasonry. And we have Sam Giancana, who was in the mafia, was also involved, as well as others in the mafia were involved as well. This information about Sam Giancana being involved is from the book Double Cross, which I showed you in part 1. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to share. But it's such a big topic that there are probably some things that I haven't mentioned or forgot to mention. I can't cover everything, but yeah, that's what I've learned, and many other things that I've learned. It was definitely the CIA, the mafia, the government, the military-industrial complex, especially the Catholic Church and the Jesuits were involved in the assassination of JFK, because he was going against orders, he was going against the world order, and they had to be removed. I've also read, might have been a book or an article that said that peace is not conducive to the world order. That war is more conducive to how the world actually works rather than peace. So JFK was going against that, and in fact, in that book called JFK and the Unspeakable, it says that JFK was becoming friendly with Khrushchev, the Russian president or Russian premier, and they were writing secret letters to each other, and JFK wanted to have peace between the US and Russia. But of course, Russia was the Bolshevik Revolution was actually funded by Wall Street. It was funded by Americans, American bankers, in the same way that Hitler and the Nazis were funded by bankers as well. So Normally, what happens in conflict or in war is that both sides are supported by bankers. The bankers are working on behalf of the Catholic Church, as I've said many times. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to share in this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know.